If you've seen any videos on my channel before this one, I'm sure that you've realized that my favorite genre is RPGs. Though if I had to make a top 3 list, number 2 and 3 would be a tie of stealth and rhythm games, the latter of which is what I want to talk about today. I recently purchased both Rock Band 4 and Guitar Hero Live and have been having a blast between the two, especially Rock Band 4. I was planning to do a compare and contrast of the two titles before realizing I had very little to say about them. Partially because if you've played one guitar-based rhythm game, you've essentially played them all, but also because so much of what would go into a critique of a rhythm game would be subjective. Does the input method work well? Do you like the music on offer? There you go, you've got a good rhythm game. Lucky for me, the indie scene has produced a few rhythm games that are more mechanically driven, mostly because they are rhythm RPGs. You heard me right, 2 of my favorite genres in one place. As soon as I found these games, I knew I had to talk about them. First, we have Before the Echo, developed by Iridium Studios. The game was first released under the title Sequence back in 2011 before legal action from a certain board game company forced a rebranding. Before the Echo is the first rhythm RPG ever made, at least based upon the information I could find. It even predates the better-known theater rhythm Final Fantasy by about half a year. Second, we have the Metronomicon, a title by developer Puba that came out in September of 2016. Fortunately for the developers, it seems to have been met with a bit more popularity than Before the Echo, thanks to some touring and demos at several conventions. Some of you may be wondering why I left out Crypt of the Necrodancer, and I have 2 reasons for that. Crypt of the Necrodancer already has a huge following, and since it's a roguelike, it fits more into a genre all its own, while Before the Echo and the Metronomicon have more in common from a gameplay standpoint. Well, I feel that's enough background, let's get into the review. Metronomicon vs. Before the Echo. Which rhythm game RPG comes out on top? Well, since these games are at least partially RPGs, we might as well start with the story. Metronomicon contains a comedic throwaway plot about a group of musical warriors who are sent out to stop dance parties being held by monsters that threaten to destroy the world. Yeah, it's just as crazy as it sounds. If I'm being blunt, I couldn't care less about the Metronomicon story. It's nice that the devs tried to implement one in the first place, and the fact that it focuses on comedy was a good decision, even if most of its jokes didn't land for me. Unfortunately, the writing came off as ridiculously hammy, and the voice acting, while technically superior than Before the Echoes, did very little to bolster the experience. Luckily, delivering a good story was not the game's primary goal, so it did not have a detrimental effect on my enjoyment of the game in the slightest. Alternatively, Before the Echo surprised me with the quality of its narrative. That's not to say that the plot was outstanding, but it had my attention, which in itself is admirable considering that plots in rhythm games are arguably unnecessary. I really want to avoid spoilers here considering it's such a short game in the first place, but it has a compelling mystery story with a decent exploration of sci-fi themes sprinkled in. I want to reiterate that I wasn't at the edge of my seat, but I was genuinely curious enough to always be looking forward to the next bout of dialogue. Speaking of dialogue, I'm sorry I have to say this, but the experience was brought down a bit by some painful vocal performances. They aren't all dreadful all the time, but these people are clearly not actors. In fact, one of the lead designers voiced the main character, and it was almost enough to ruin the experience for me because the story is so focused around what was supposed to be witty banter and exposition between the 2 leads. I give them an A for effort, and I feel bad for coming down so hard on this aspect of the presentation, but the decent plot had me craving better line delivery. Don't let that dampen your spirits, however. Iridium's attempt at telling a compelling story within a rhythm game is the only reason this video even has a story section. Otherwise, I would have skipped right over it. So seriously, all things considered, this should all be taken as praise and constructive criticism, not as a damning statement. Of course, we can't discuss a rhythm game without talking about the music. Have you ever been to a nightclub? Me neither, but the Metronomicon is what I assume it would sound like. Its track list is composed almost entirely of EDM with some rare hip-hop and rock thrown in for good measure. While not the type of music you'd find on my daily track list, it works incredibly well for the game, and I enjoyed the music that was on offer in that context. There were even a couple songs that I do find myself listening to outside of the game despite my usual tastes, like Live It Up by Shiny Toy Guns for example, which is a song that has been highly promoted in the advertising for this game. This leads us to an important point. I find it quite impressive that the indie dev studio behind the Metronomicon was able to get so many songs licensed for use in their game. Unfortunately, this means that when comparing the games to one another, the Metronomicon has a very clear and some would argue even unfair advantage over Before the Echo. The Metronomicon contains 50 playable songs from a multitude of artists, not including available DLC, while Before the Echo contains a scant 12, all of which were composed by one man, Ronald Jenkins. He's not a man I'm familiar with, but he has a decent following, and after playing the game I could see why. Unfortunately, there's just not enough variety in style, tone, or song selection to make it compete on that front. In the end, both games have incredibly fitting soundtracks to the games they're in. The Metronomicon is just one big party, while Before the Echo falls back on a more subdued but still quite catchy track list that fits the more serious tone the story presents. But more important than the song selection is the gameplay, so let's see how the gameplay breaks down. The entirety of Before the Echo is based around the idea of risk and reward, which is a design philosophy that I applaud, at least in theory. Unfortunately, the end result of the risk side of things is simply tedium. The flow of Before the Echo is based almost entirely on the procurement of synthesis materials, which you must then combine to create better equipment and even key items that you progress through the game's levels. The problem is, item creation is never guaranteed, but instead given a percentage chance to succeed based upon how much experience you're willing to give up. Now thankfully, a failed attempt doesn't destroy the synthesis components, but it does still weaken your character, at some points costing the player several levels of character strength if they want to ensure that the item is successfully crafted. The use of experience points as currency was something that I initially thought was brilliant, as EXP is arguably the most important resource a player has in an RPG. The downside to this, however, is that it doesn't take long for the game to devolve into a grind, and this repetition is made all the more painful when you add in the previously mentioned track list of only 12 songs. Take into account that there are about 30 combat scenarios in the game, many of which you will be repeating multiple times to farm for rare drops, and you can see how the soundtrack and gameplay, regardless of quality, could become tedious when associated with such busy work. That having been said, Before the Echo's gameplay in terms of combat is good. It continues with the theme of risk and reward by focusing on the use and management of spells and mana. While in combat, the player is forced to switch between 3 different lanes, much like in a game like Amplitude, only instead of each lane representing an instrument, each lane represents your defense, your spell casting, and your ability to recharge mana respectively. To cast a spell, whether defensive, damaging, or healing, the player must play the chain of notes properly after selecting which spell they want to use. This becomes challenging when you have to balance it with the 2 other lanes. Every note you miss in the defense column does damage to you, making it a high priority. So do you risk a spell failing to keep your health up, or do you take the damage to ensure the spell is successfully cast? This creates a strange dichotomy where you always need to be on the defensive, but the game forces you to be aggressive by giving you a time limit. After all, if the song ends, you automatically lose. I must admit that these design decisions made the game's harder difficulties absolutely brutal to me. I beat the game on the normal setting, but I didn't have the patience to complete my attempted run on the hardest difficulty. That being said, expert rhythm game aficionados will likely love the challenge that this game provides. The Metronomicon, on the other hand, has a different design philosophy and feels like a more traditional RPG in a lot of ways. In battle, you use a party of 4 characters, all of them have 3 abilities equipped at one time. They stack on top of each other in tiers, and the player gets to decide which abilities go in which slots. The higher tiers become more powerful, but take longer to activate because you have to hit the notes in each tier sequentially, meaning that a lot of the planning and strategy takes place before the battle even begins. It plays to the strengths of the RPG side of things because the challenges reinforce the need to become familiar with all of the available character strengths and weaknesses. I'm sure those of you who frequent my content, especially the Final Fantasy XV dissection, are sick of hearing me talk about this by now, but this rhythm RPG actually allows for and encourages the use of party dynamics, such as tanking, healing, and DPS, which is what makes the combat so interesting. It's an incredibly well thought out system that works far more elegantly than it has any right to, and it works perfectly to accentuate the strengths of the rhythm game formula without getting in the way of it. In terms of pacing, the Metronomicon tends to focus on forward momentum. Even if you do feel the need to grind before moving forward, there are numerous challenges to complete which grant bonus rewards on top of the initial experience points. Goals like kill 8 enemies in a row or defeat the boss in a certain amount of time help to spice things up beyond the standard survive to the end of the song scenario that is the norm. This setup is taken to its logical extreme in the arena mode, which places further restrictions on the player, such as forcing them to rack up a bunch of points with a specific level capped party. There is always something to do in the Metronomicon, which is one of its biggest strengths. Getting higher scores, completing challenges in the arena, getting new equipment, experimenting with party builds and ability setups. I found myself going back to it multiple times after I'd already completed the story, and still the desire to continue playing it now. It's incredibly addicting and has a lot of lasting appeal. Before the Echo, on the other hand, feels much more like a one and done deal to me. The spell system didn't leave me feeling like experimenting because there are spells that are just clearly better than others. There are no real challenge modes or incentives to replay songs either beyond the synthesis system, which most people will likely feel compelled to do anyway since it's the main way of increasing your strength and ensuring you're ready for the next battle. Sure, there is a secret boss and you can play the game on a higher difficulty, but the game already has players repeating the same content so much that the thought of doing it all again doesn't sound at all appealing, at least not anytime soon. I feel my single playthrough was worth the investment. I want to make that very clear. I just don't see myself going back to it like I do the Metronomicon. Since this is primarily an RPG channel, I have a rather appropriate analogy I'd like to present. The Metronomicon is to Before the Echo, as Final Fantasy is to Dragon Quest. Before the Echo is the first of its kind, and because of that it is understandably lacking in a few areas. Even so, it's worth it to see the birth of a genre, and it holds up as a decent, though not at all mind-blowing experience. The Metronomicon, on the other hand, cranked the dial up to 11, offering more nuanced gameplay with greater variety and creativity in its design that refined the rhythm RPG formula. In the end, I would actually recommend both of these games if they sound at all interesting to you. But in terms of objective quality, there is unfortunately a clear winner here. The Metronomicon just has far more to do and has far more lasting appeal. Then again, pricing for these two titles varies significantly, with Before the Echo costing a paltry $5, while the Metronomicon costs $20. Maybe even a bit more if you feel like bolstering the song selection with DLC. That makes Before the Echo a more appealing choice for the more frugal or curious. So, which will it be? Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy? I mean, luckily we live in a world where we can enjoy both. I know I do. And for those of you who are wondering if my analogy implies that Final Fantasy is better than Dragon Quest, well, yes. Yes, I am implying that. I'll see you guys next time on Stiles Reviews. Okay, I was totally kidding about the Dragon Quest thing, but you should have seen the look on your face.